This is Building Resilient Aerospace Businesses, moderated by Mark Gell, Senior Managing Director, European Aerospace and Defence Lead at Accenture.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Gillet. I am the Aerospace and Defence Industry Lead for Accenture in Europe, and I am very pleased to welcome you for this first panel session that I will moderate. Building Resilient Aerospace Businesses is our theme today, a theme that resonates a lot with the unprecedented time our industry is facing and has been facing the last 7 months. As you know, in physics, resilience is about resisting to shocks. But for this industry, we are probably facing more than a shock, probably what will be called an historical disruption that has been transforming and will transform deeply our industry. So it deserves reflection on how we recover, but also how to be stronger for the next disruption that will inevitably come. I will introduce the session by briefly referring to feedback Accenture received a few weeks ago from Aerospace and Defense executives that we questioned on how they would characterize the pandemic impact on their industry. And 3 features popped up. The first one, and probably the most important one, has been the demand shock and drop, with certainly a more drastic impact on commercial, with between -20 to -40% revenue drop. But in the panel, there was a consensus between commercial and defense industry that the demand profile of this industry, mid-term and long-term, will be different. And this is clearly a paradigm shift for our industry that has been for years one of the very few that had an average 5 to 7 average steady state backlog, and this will probably not be the case anymore. Beyond this first impact, acknowledged by everyone, the second one was around operation and supplier network disruption. Here, no real surprise, no real difference compared to other B2B or B2C companies, with their supply chain being disrupted by the travel bans, by the confinement, by distancing measures that you're probably all still experiencing in your own company. And the third impact, highlighted by executives, was around workforce, with overcapacity in many of our industry due to the demand and the supply profiles, but also due to the emergence of new way of working linked to the acceleration of the digitization during the period. From a quantitative standpoint, if we look at the aerospace and defense company revenues and or market capitalization, this industry has been in the top 3 with travel and banking, top 3 of being the most impacted by the COVID situation. So our industry is impacted and will be impacted. And this is where resilience is coming into the play. To face current challenges, but also to seize new opportunities and also to anticipate any new disruption that will probably come. Let me introduce you to our great panel today to discuss future resilience in our industry, with representatives from prestigious aerospace and defense companies headquartered in different parts of the world, covering both civil and military businesses and different parts of our industry value chain. We have the pleasure to host today Badar Al-Olama, Executive Director of Aerospace at Mubadala, Michael Johansson, Chief Executive Officer of Saab, and Tim Cahill, Senior Vice President of Lockheed Martin International. So hello to the 3 of you. And before asking your perspective on future resilience, I would like to start, if it's okay for you, by getting your views on how deep this crisis has been for your company and how you have faced it. So maybe start with you, Badar. Can you tell us how Mubadala have been facing the crisis and what maybe has been the most difficult part from it?
Thank you, Mark. I mean, I take a deep breath when you tell me how has the crisis impacted our businesses, because when you look at our portfolio today, we actually make aircraft parts, we fix aircraft engines, and we also lease spare engines and rotables and components to airlines. I mean, if there is anything that we could have escaped, all three businesses of ours has gotten impacted severely. And I'm not talking, a blip, a hiccup. No, this is really something that has been very devastating. And obviously I can assume that the impact is not just on us, but it's also across the entire ecosystem. So let's take Strata, for example. Strata, which makes aircraft parts and aircraft components for big OEMs like Saab, but also for companies like Airbus and Boeing. More than 50% of our revenues, our top line, has dissipated, just, gone away. Now, to be in a situation like that, to be in a situation where you have to react and be ready and be resilient, it's very difficult when it's 50% and it's not 10, 20, right? 10, 20 itself is an impact, but talk about 50%. When you look at our MRO business, Sanad Aerotech has long-term contracts with both GE and Rolls-Royce to actually provide services on the Trent 700 platform, on the Gen X platform, even with IAE on the V2500 platform. Again, when airlines are not flying and they're grounded, guess what? There's not going to be any MRO. So again, we got impacted, not just now, but even being impacted going forward, because some of these airlines have their own business sustainability at risk. And then linking that up with our leasing business. Some of the customers, they have been on their edge. One of our customers, which is Virgin Australia, has already declared bankruptcy. So when I look at, what could go wrong, everything is going wrong. But there is a positive side to that story. I'm very fortunate, and I say this, that we have very, very good CEOs for Sanad, for the Aerotech and the capital business, as well as for Strata. Because when I look at what Strata did in this crisis, they, instead of throwing in the towel and saying this is disaster and this is the end of the world for us, they actually went about to repurpose the capabilities that they have and start producing something that was critical to our environment, to our economy, which was PPE. They started producing N95 masks and started making sure that the supplies were abundant, because some countries were banning the export of N95, they were banning the export of the raw materials as well. When I look at Sanad Aerotech and Sanad Capital, both CEOs went to their customers, GE, Rolls-Royce, the airlines, and worked hand in hand, saying, we understand you have a problem, and we will have a problem, but let's find a better way to actually make sure that this problem can be rectified across, in the next few years as the industry recovers. So as bad as it has been, we were already quite, very lean, very well structured to actually sustain the impact, but also to recover or try to recover from the severe impact of COVID.
Thanks a lot, Bala. So we felt the severity of the impact, but also the positive room for future evolution, including a new way of working, which is something interesting. Let's move to Michael with Saab. So Saab is more in the defense sector. Mm-hmm. So Michael, have you had the same kind of severity and challenges during this COVID impact the last 7 months?
Well, I think it looks a bit different for us, and I'll try to explain. First of all, as any company, you go into, as Badr said, the shock mode. You sort of start a crisis management team, and the first thing you do is try to protect your own employees and finding ways of managing the situation. And I may remind you that Sweden has been sort of famous now because we took a completely different approach than many other countries. So we haven't really been in a complete lockdown. We didn't close any schools. We sort of kept things going. So in Sweden particularly, I would say that we have taken many measures, and there are directives and regulations in Sweden as well. but it's not very much up to the individuals to make sure that we follow these things. So the responsibility is for the individual. So as a company, we have sort of implemented everything we can do in terms of social distancing, hygiene measures, cleaning, not traveling, what have you, to make sure that we follow all the things, but we have kept our operations up and running. So all our sites with all our 14,000 employees in Sweden, as an example, has been up and running, and we've been doing quite well. Looking at the effect on Saab as a whole, I agree with Badr. On the commercial aviation side, on the aerostructures side, it's been completely imploding, and a lot of measures has been taken to move capacity elsewhere within the organization. Now that's sort of 15-17% of Saab's revenue. So it's not sort of a big effect if you take the totality into account. It's serious, but it's not that much. On the defense side, it's been a bit different. I think we have been able to continue with our large programs, and we have been able to sign new contracts. Everything that started before the COVID-19 in terms of prospects has been going quite well. So we have secured contracts all over the world despite this, because we have a sort of an organization with people in many countries that's been capable of continued discussions with customers. Now, delivering is a different story, and I think we have to find sort of innovative ways of delivering. We have had teams of people going to different countries around the world, voluntarily stepping into quarantine for weeks to be able to step out of a hotel room or something to do tests and then deliver the equipment. We have started broadcasting exercises to do factory acceptance tests remotely with authorities present, but securing sort of with other customers in the world that we have actually performed the test and we can start shipping. So we've implemented many measures to be able to continue the operations accordingly. I would say that the most severe thing is, of course, to manage your supply chain. And to us, we are a company that we have gone all the way when it comes to globalization in terms of finding the best company with the best technology, the lowest cost, the best partners all around the world. And that has been the biggest problem, to keep up with what they are doing, I would say, and how long they will be able to sustain their business. In some countries, they haven't even answered the phone for 8 weeks. In other countries, they've been working with us, and we have, of course, as any other company, taking measures to provide them and support them and make sure that we do things differently with them. And I come back to supply chains later on, but I mean, that I would say have been the biggest effect on us, that even though it looks quite good now in the beginning, because we're not a just-in-time type of company, we have to understand that even though we have things in stock and so forth, medium long term, we may have the bigger effects if we do not work with the supply chain and sort of continue to handle this in a proper way. So I have respect for this. I mean, then we have the economic effect. It seems good right now. We have been flat revenue-wise, compensating on the defense side for what's happened on the civilian side, on the commercial side. But long term, what will happen with the economies in different parts of the world? How will priorities look like? Even though I have no sort of signals right now that countries won't prioritize their societies in terms of security and protecting their borders. I mean, this is huge effects on countries' economies. So there's still, the jury is still out to see what's going to happen going forward, even though I'm quite positive. So that's sort of a summary. We're quite well off, but we've been hit as well, of course, on the commercial side.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I think there's a lot of lesson learned to get from this crisis on supply chain and demand resilience. So we'll come back to this topic afterwards. I will jump to Tim here with Tim. Lockheed Martin is a very large corporation, also pretty much focused on defense. Lockheed Martin is implemented in all parts of the world, subject to, I would say, geopolitical tension for quite a while now. So what this health crisis has brought to Lockheed Martin in terms of new challenges And second question, how is your view regarding the future situation and visibility you have midterm, long term?
Mark, thank you. And thank you for having me today, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I'm really gratified we were able to do this, given all the challenges. The first I would say is we're very similar to what Michael mentioned. Our exposure, for us, our exposure is very limited in the commercial side. And so it tends to be more on the national defense side. And so, for us immediately, as with most companies trying to go into this crisis, you look to how do you protect your people, because we actually have to figure out a way to get them in and continue to build things. So how do we protect our people and their families and not be a contributor to the community spread, if you will, but be anything, if anything, be a damper to that community spread. I think we also found ourselves, as you would expect, in a situation where we needed to be good community partners. We are in nearly 70 countries in the world in one form or another, and finding creative ways to support the local medical facilities and hospitals, and providing PPE where we could, or providing donations to help folks was all very critical to ramp up. And you do those kind of things ordinarily, but you do them routine, and they happen at their own pace. This was certainly more of a crisis mode, and there was great need both in the United States and throughout the world. And so that was a priority for us. And then, of course, as I mentioned, just continuing to keep the production lines open. For us, many of the countries, if not all the countries that we are engaged with, their national security needs haven't changed. The world is just as dangerous in their neighborhoods as it was the day before the coronavirus really hit us. And so by and large, they were still looking to us to provide the equipment and the services and the know-how and the analysis that we always provide, at least on the same time frame that we were before. And so being able to actually hit those milestones and make sure that we can proceed and meet our commitments was of critical importance to us. And so, for us, I think we're pretty proud of the way the company overall reacted to this. I don't think any of us could ever claim that we were 100% prepared for this. But I think the team rapidly coalesced around the things that we needed to do. Michael brought up the supply chain. That was of critical importance to us. Not every company is as large as we are, and sometimes they hinge upon one or two critical people, small companies. And making sure they're healthy was very important. Our engagement, I think, and with the customers was a significant challenge to us as well. I think it's interesting how dependent we had become, and maybe to some extent I think still are, to this personal contact. And we've had customers throughout the world that, quite honestly, at the beginning of this did not want to talk to us on the phone. Really, they didn't want to do Zoom. They didn't want to do Microsoft Teams. That's not the culture. That's not what you're used to. You meet folks face to face, and if you have a real crisis and you can't get there, you pick up the phone. But you don't do that as a matter of course. And so there was a bit of a cultural divide there, and it varied by country. Some countries embraced that quickly, and I know within the Middle East we were quickly having a Zoom and Microsoft Team meetings, and the folks within the Middle East really responded well to that in a rapid fashion. Other parts of the world, it took us a couple of months to get to a point where we get into some routines, and so we still suffer, I think, a little bit from that. We still all feel like we're missing that personal face-to-face contact, the way you really build relationships. And of course, you build relationships outside of meetings, not just in them. And so we're lacking that as well. But I think we've clearly learned a lot, and I'm sure we'll explore some of those things that we've learned. But it has been an experience, I think, from a business standpoint that hasn't impacted us yet. But I think Michael made a great point. We have yet to see what's going to happen as countries deal with the economic conditions as an after effect of this pandemic.
Thanks a lot, team. So, I got out of that probably the impact from the crisis on commercial is very different from what has been experienced in the defense sector. But each of you have mentioned issues and challenges around demand, around supply chain, around the workforce. And what I take away as well is that there have been already a lot of actions that have been taken, to mitigate this crisis, to face the current challenges, but also to prepare the future with, and you mentioned that, Tim, a new way of behaving, new way of working for probably a different world in the future. So I think it's a good transition to speak about midterm, long-term of our industry and what you believe are the building blocks to be more resilient and to be prepared to go back to growth, but also to be more resilient. I would like to start with the demand aspect and ask the question how to generate a more resilient demand. The answer in the short term is highly depending for sure on the evolution of the sanitary situation, probably also of each government stimulus, on MODs, on airlines action plan, but shouldn't we think of a more profound change when defining future demand? But maybe getting your view first on how and with whom we could define a more resilient demand, and to your point of view, how innovation can contribute to this demand agenda in the future.
I mean, it's a brilliant question, Mark. As Tim said, it's a new way of behaving, a new way of working, but for me, it's also about introducing a new way of thinking. And I can I can say that in three terms, right? So I'll explain my thought process in three different aspects, which I think are important. The first one is we really need to take a hard look on airlines, and we need to redefine the business model. Think about it this way, right? An airline is actually feeding the ground handlers, it's feeding catering, it's feeding fuel, it's feeding the airport, it's feeding the pilots, the passengers, and unfortunately for that airline, it's also competing on price. So when you take out the airline equation, the whole ecosystem gets impacted. I mean, some data points to share. The airline ecosystem employs over 65 million people. It generates $2.7 trillion to the GDP. That's the size, the global GDP. That's the size of the UK, if you think about it, right? So what I think is going to happen is the impact of COVID is going to lead to some form of consolidation or fewer larger players consolidating their markets. I think the attention will divert towards single aisle because single aisle offers a much more economical business case. That will come at the expense of wide bodies. And that concerns me. I mean, it concerns obviously Airbus and Boeing, but it concerns me as well because it has a direct impact on strata. And when you look at wide bodies, what does the wide body aircraft promise? Some studies are saying it offers $600 million contribution to a local economy, right? It brings in new innovation, whether it was customer experience or even technology on the aircraft. We're all talking about climate change and the fact that airlines and aircrafts are contributing to CO2 emissions. I mean, the next evolution for wide body aircrafts is probably going to drive towards cleaner emissions, right? So when you start compromising wide body aircrafts in terms of growth, in terms of new development, because airlines are probably going to go for single aisles, airlines are probably going to fly older fleet longer and try to avoid making new capex, I think we need to get to a point where we can introduce some radical thinking. And that needs us to reinvent the airline industry. So from my perspective, I think what we need to come up with is new business models that will support those large aircrafts play the role that they were designed for. I mean, think about what they call fifth freedom rights. Emirates, for example, flies from Dubai to Milan and can fly from Milan to New York. I mean, why can't we have more of these models so that these big aircrafts can actually carry more passengers and it doesn't have to fly back to Dubai, or Etihad doesn't have to fly back to Abu Dhabi. It can continue. And you can create new markets, create new opportunities, and obviously you're contributing to whichever market or to whichever destination that you're flying to. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need to be more open-minded about open skies. There was a day and a time where open skies was a taboo. It was a topic that nobody wanted to address, right? But honestly, the well-being and the sustainability of the sector should be prioritized over the self-interest of a few airlines or a few airports. So it really requires this collaboration. The second area that I think warrants us to talk about is, again, taking a hard look on the supply chain. You heard Michael, you heard Tim talk about the importance of the supply chain. And I think what I will talk about is pretty much liberalizing technology adoption. As dynamic and as forward-looking as the aerospace sector is, again, I do not want to put my two colleagues on the spot, but there's a lot of backward-looking approach that's taken with respect to adopting new technologies. And this can be in the form of digital twins. I shared a recent example about, when the nuclear industry tends to certify or qualify certain aspects of the operations, they can't go for a physical test. Yet the aircraft industry, the aerospace industry, goes for physical tests on wear and tear and damage of specific components. When we look at the supply chain and we look at the aerospace industry, when they want to drive costs out, most times they focus on labor and they focus on the cost of labor and the headcount, as opposed to really trusting technology, bringing in 3D printing as a new way of actually producing aircraft parts, or looking at alternative energy sources, for example, on fuel cells or hydrogen, and introducing them into making aircrafts electric. So I guess we should look even to the supply chain and think about new business models. And similar to how banks form syndicates, they work with each other to actually address the needs of their customers, we should look into alliances. Alliances for the MRO supply chain, alliances for the manufacturing supply chain, to work together when the time comes to serve the needs of the customer. The last point that I'll bring up, Mark, and this is probably to me one of the most important, is not to think about what the situation is today, but to make sure that the impact, let me say, the certain sort of devastation that we felt should never ever happen again. And what does that entail? It entails us that we should be faster, quicker, and better in convening as a sector. We should coordinate our efforts on the recovery side. We should collaborate, even as competitors collaborate, to minimize the damage. And this takes me to the point, why is it so important to have the Global Aerospace Summit? This is where we were convening as an industry to talk about these challenges, talk about these issues. And I'm glad, when I listen to what Michael and Tim are saying, this is just, information, knowledge, things that could support the rest of the industry actually understand how the more sophisticated, the more, let me say, structured organizations are able to resolve and stay resilient in this sort of unprecedented time.
Thanks a lot, but I would will come back to the new technologies that is probably a driving theme for resilience in the future. I just want to come back to the collaboration and new business model you were mentioning, including with innovation. What do you think is missing these days to federate more airlines, airport, OEMs, tier 1, tier 2, in order for them to better collaborate to what you are expecting, which is a more, end-to-end collaborative industry? What's missing?
I think, the difficulty that we have, we live in capital markets which are actually rewarding you for being better than your competitor. But in reality, being better than your competitor in a situation of difficulty, or a situation of what we have as today, a force majeure, a pandemic that has completely stopped airlines from moving or traveling or anything. This requires us all, again, to sit down and have an honest discussion. We can't all profit at each other's expense. There has to be a compromise. And the compromise has to be fair for the future sustainability of the sector. And this is what I think is lacking. I think it's very difficult to get competitors to sit on the same table and talk about what the future entails. And how can we make sure that our supply chains are not just resilient, but they're also flexible. So that, to me, I think, where it really matters today is to have the airports, the airlines, the OEMs, the suppliers, the MRO service providers, the ground handlers sit down together. We all need to work together. And that is a fact that you will see in a lot of other sectors. The supply chain actually works very well with each other to ensure that the end product does not get disrupted for the customer.
Thanks a lot. But I would like to reflect on and rebound on your faster, better, and quicker statement and flexibility requirement, because it's pretty much linked to the agility. And I want to introduce that, agility to, for sure, address the demand volatility that we have, but also to address our future challenges. Michael, I will hand over to you because I know that agility imperative is something important for you, including within supply chain. Can you tell us a bit more about what you have in mind behind agility requirements and how it could help resilience in the future?
Well, again, we touched upon supply chain in the introduction, and I think for many, it's here and now. I don't think that's the case for the defense industry really, but we have a little bit more time to work with these issues. I think if we look upon it, I think many of us now start thinking about the trade-off between finding the best technology somewhere in the world and also the lowest cost, but security of supply and managing the supply chain in the proper way also comes into play. So I think assessments will be done without changing everything, but assessments will be done how to cope with these things together, going forward. So there will be many discussions between OEMs and their supply chains going forward. I don't see it though. I'll come back to agility, but it's also dangerous to start sort of protecting regions and countries and to tell yourself that you have to do everything locally and create some sort of strategic autonomy, which I don't really believe in at all, because what's driving ideas and innovation is competition. I mean, there is new ways of doing things, and that will only come from having companies and competing on how to do things. So it's a bit contradicting. I'm afraid if you look upon this regional sort of approach then to create security supply, I'd like to see the global perspective continue, but you need to find ways of coping with that going forward, I think. So I would say that to find agile ways of handling the supply chain, and it's about sort of technology. The digitalization can and will help that a lot. I think today you can work with data management and packaging your sort of equipments and components or whatever you do, both the way you do it in sort of ways of working, the processes and the tools you use, but also how you actually describe your product in terms of the parameters you describe your product. So you can move, if I could call it a digital package somewhere else and set it up more flexibly if you are sort of encountering crisis or logistical problems or disconnect between countries or pandemics or other crises. You have to have sort of an agile way of working with that. It's easy to talk about an agile. I talk to companies that can set up shop really quickly in other countries with the right infrastructure because they have everything in the pack, so to say, and they don't need to move the competent core personnel that they have in another country. And they can sort of close it down if things not goes bad, or if the need or demand is going down, they can close it down again. So you can do these things, but we have to come up with the solutions where you don't have to sort of recertify the tools and the infrastructure every time you go about and doing these things. You have to find a way of including the certification of which tools and what kind of ways of working and processes you use when you set it up somewhere else. And that's where I think in the defense industry you have, and also in the civilian aerospace, of course, you have an enormous requirement on certifying how you actually produce things and how you develop things. That must be in this digital package somehow. because otherwise it's too costly to set it up elsewhere. I think it's quite feasible to go more agile in also moving things around, but still finding the technology globally and work with the right partners like that. Now, this comes with another problem, of course, that you have to work with, and that is how you secure your infrastructure on the IT side. How do you actually work with secure cloud technology? How do you work with that type of environment to make this happen? It's so important that goes hand in hand. But I'm all for the globalization. I think, however, many companies will take a step back to look at the sort of regional aspects of things, but we must find a new technology and digitalization to create agile supply chains going forward, so we can sort of compete and continue the competition, because that will drive innovation and the best going forward as well. I do not believe in sort of strategic autonomy in countries protecting themselves. That will not drive innovation.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Tim, I will maybe let you react on the global supply chain resilience point from Michael and the technology enablement attached to it. And I have also one additional question for you, which is around the workforce transformation. We see more and more new ways of working. This is linked for sure to the pandemic, but also to other patterns that already existed and that probably the COVID has amplified. Would you rank the workforce transformation as a key pillar of our future resilience?
Yeah, Mark. So on supply chain, I think absolutely. I think I would echo what both Badr and Michael talked about, the importance of the supply chain, and I would say that as I mentioned, the fact that so many of our suppliers are very small businesses, and one person in that business gets coronavirus, can shut it down, and the ability when they're not delivering to make payroll and to make and to pay overhead and rent and all that can put these businesses out. Just I think we've all seen some of that in our local economies. How many times we walk down the streets in our own cities and wondered how many of those businesses are really going to come back. Well, in national security and aerospace business, you can't afford to have that happen. We may have an absolute world-class, fabulous production line for F-35s in Fort Worth, but a single small part that we can't get can bring that all to a halt. So from our standpoint, we Lockheed Martin put out hundreds of millions of dollars to about 8,000 suppliers worldwide in advance payments, of which about 5,000 of those were small businesses. So these were advance payments ahead of delivery to ensure that they had a continuity of revenue coming in, so they could, meet their rent, meet their payroll and all, even if they had interruptions that were caused by whatever reason in the pandemic, whether it be, local conditions or whether it be illness within the employees themselves. So part of that was just very important for us, I think, to ensure, and the U.S. government did a great job advancing us that, by the way, that those funds so that we could make those kind of payments worldwide. And I think that was very important for us to do. So if you think about the supply chain, there's that part of it. That's the triage. That's to ensure that we come out of this with a supply chain that's still resilient enough to keep us going both through it and post. I think long term, I agree with Michael. I think there's a real concern. I think if you pull back too much around security of supply, you do stifle competition and you stifle the flexibility. I think we're much better off the more we look at supply chain as a global problem, as a way to build second source, so that this is one type of crisis that is affecting the entire globe, but not every crisis affects the entire globe. And if it is real regional, if you don't have a supply chain and duplication within your supply chain that's in various regions of the world, you could be subject to local conditions that put you in exactly the same situation as if there was some sort of a global pandemic. So I think there's a short-term triage that will continue to get us through all this. And then there's a long-term, but I think the long-term is to continue, as Michael said, this process of globalizing the supply chain and building resilience that way. Relative to the workforce, I think it's an amazing cultural transformation that we're undergoing. Certainly, I know, I guess I'll speak for us, but I suspect that most of the defense and aerospace companies have a similar thing. We weren't really well wired for large quantities of our workforce to work remotely. We were an in-person kind of a business. In the decades, and I won't say how many decades that I've been in this business, I've never worked remotely unless I was on a trip somewhere and had to call in for something. Always came into the office and always interacted with folks in the office. And so I know many of us had to develop new tools. We had to find different ways of ensuring we were in touch and we were communicating. And I think that's for us, that's our entire workforce. We don't know how this will settle out when the dust settles, but I'll tell you within Lockheed Martin, every week, this is a significant discussion topic. When we have our staff meetings at the executive level, the one topic we talk about the most is where are we going post-pandemic relative to the workforce, the remoteness or not of the workforce, how we're taking what we've learned from all of this and applying it, because some of these trends, of course, were already continuing prior to this crisis, but these have accelerated, the crisis has accelerated these trends, I think, significantly. And we've got to figure out a way to do this. And there's obviously, for us, there's folks that just can't work remotely. They've got to be on a production line. They've got to put parts on an airplane, for example. But there's many that's not the case. And even for those that are there on production lines, the work is transforming rapidly. It's, in the old days when you might have a lathe cutting a metal part, that's not quite the same anymore. If you look at our modern production environments, it looks more like a computer lab than it does an old oil and lathe machine shop. So it's incredible, and the talent and the capabilities that we need from our operators, for example, and so moving our workforce quickly to that kind of environment, and then increasing that digitalization. So again, you can do these kinds of things remotely, whether it be the design or the layout for production. Do that while you're anywhere in the world, frankly, is increasingly critically important. And then, I think the other thing I would say is it's always very interesting as you try and set up policies, and when you're working in dozens and dozens of countries, every country is different, and every country has different cultures and different laws and different norms. And so trying to adapt to each of those to find the common things that you need to do as a corporation, and yet allow for reasonable local variations, I think is very, very important going forward. And we're getting better at that, but I think we've all got probably a ways to go.
Thanks a lot, Tim, for this enlightening comments on the global supply chain imperatives and workforce transformation. I reviewed also this workforce transformation by many executives in the audience as being a very big challenge when it's related to rotate the workforce to the new future with the resilience we're mentioning. I heard in all the information you made a lot of comment regarding digitization imperative and its acceleration as a big enabler for resilience. In Accenture, we see digitization in each and every CEO agenda and discussion we have with CEOs. These days, it's about providing cost efficiency, agility, speed to market, but also, as mentioned by Badar and others, a kind of a good way to introduce new business models, a new platform, new ecosystem, and probably with something we didn't touch upon today, which is around cloud transformation, which is probably in the future resilience, something that will show up in civil, but also in defense with system of system, platform, and cloud. I will conclude by saying thank you to all of our panelists. I'm sure that they enjoyed the session. I hope we brought to the audience some ideas and reflection point on how to be more resilient in the future. As you know, there are many ingredients to go back to growth in a sustainable way and resilient way. We mentioned today global supply chain resilience as a key focus point. We also touch upon collaboration, innovation, digitization that are probably ingredients for the recipe of this resilience. So I hope you enjoy the session. Thanks a lot for your attention. and we wish you a good continuation with the summit. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.